Marae Rabbi. Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Shlomo Gottesman, and I have the privilege of being a guest on this program to help facilitate what I think is an important discussion. The topic for today's presentation is the importance of being nizar, of being careful in macholes asurais and forbidden foods in general. And then specifically, we will talk about the complex halachos of Bishul Akum. In general, kashrus is something that we're all trained to do from an early age, and we therefore don't necessarily appreciate the difficulties that go into making sure and ensuring that we are on the higher standards. The impetus for this topic came from a wonderful week that I spent in the company of close to 500 balabatim from the United States and all across the world, from Europe, from Canada, and from Eretz Yisrael, learning these issues in Yerushalayim Ira Kodesh under the auspices of Agudah Yisrael in their annual Yarchei Kallah. The Yarchei Kallah was devoted to issues of Yayin Stam and Bishul Akum, and the feedback from participants was so positive, and the impact of hearing from such distinguished Rabbanim, masters in the subject, was so powerful that we thought that it would make sense to have it resonate even now and do a bit of a recap and revisit some of the issues that were discussed there. I'm going to give an intro into a background on the importance of the issue of zihirut, being very careful in these issues of Mechalei Akum. And then I am going to introduce two very distinguished guests, Rav Doniel Neustadt of Lakewood, New Jersey, the Rosh Rabbanim of Detroit, and the Rav Eli Gerstein, who is one of the senior halacha experts at OU Kosher, which I was astounded to learn currently certifies over 1 million products worldwide. I don't have to tell you the importance of that specific kashrus organization. Of course, there are many very chashuv kashrus organizations in our country and in Eretz Yisrael, and we are indebted to all of them. Rabbi Gerstein also will have the added benefit of illuminating us in some of the psukim of his Rabbi Muvik in Kashrus, Hagoyin Rabbi Yisrael Belsky, Zechron L'Racha, whose Eretzeit was just recently a week ago. Let me spend a few minutes here introducing the topic with a few machshavos on the importance of being nizar in Machalei Akum. Obviously, all machalos asuros fall under this rubric of being nizar, and the deraises such as basar b'chalav and tarfus are deraises. They're even more important, but we all take those extremely seriously because, after all, they're deraises. Everybody understands that Chazal made gzeiros, and even though they understood they have to make a chizuk of divrei yoser mishal Torah, nevertheless, the normal human psyche is trained to take some things more seriously than others, and therefore, Chazal, when they created the gzeiros around the Surei Macholis Yisuris Rabbanan, made sure to emphasize that these things have very important constructs, and they're very important for us to keep because of the underlying issues they were designed to address. Because I'll say that the reason we should not be eating Machalei Akum is because if we do, we become too close to the Goyim, and that could lead to Chas v'Shalom being over the Isser of Leisis Chatein Bam. It's very possible that were you to indulge in Yain Stam or in Bishul Akum, you can end up, chas v'shalom, being mitchaten with a guy. Now, you may say this is not likely. If I take a drink of a bottle, I'm not sure that it's kosher. Does that mean I'm going to marry chas v'shalom, or my children are going to intermarry? How can that be? But Chazal beruach kodsham understood that this is exactly what could happen. And let me give you a few illustrations to explain why they felt that way. There is a well-known machshava said by several Gedolei Yisrael. I've seen it brought from Rabbi Shapira. I've seen it brought from many of the Gedolei HaChasidus. But I'm going to tell you the way it is brought in B'Shem Rabbeinu Hachsam Sefer. Kedai Rabbeinu Hachsam Sefer Lismech Olav, that his pshat is Kailul, all the other people who succeeded him. One of his Einiklach, I guess, the Shevet Sefer, brings it Pia Shmua on the pasuk in Zeis HaBracha, Vayishkoin Yisrael Betach Badad. Klal Yisrael was Sheichein. Betach, they were Sheichein in a sure manner. However, it had to be Badad. It had to be alone. Says some Sefer, the kavanah of the pasuk is in reference to the nevuah of Bilam HaRasha, where Bilam HaRasha says that Klal Yisrael is Am Levadad Yishkain, a nation that dwells alone. Explains some Sefer, when Klal Yisrael, in fact, is careful to keep ourselves together and not be mitarev, not to mix with the Goyim, and therefore follow their practices and to be medama to them, then it's Yishkain Betach Beina Umais, and we are singled out as being mitzuyanim. And as the historical Hanhada of Klal Yisrael in the beginning of Galus Mitzrayim was, when we were careful in the first few days not to be Mishana Shmam L'Shainam or Levusham, and therefore they became a Goy Gadol, and they were Nechshav Bein Mitzrayim. But once that started breaking down in the Rive of the Galus and the Chaimer of the Avodah, and they started being misarev in the Goyim, then the Goyim did not take them seriously at all. And they were just another bunch of assimilated Mitzrim. And once they started following the practices of Te'eves, Rachman Latzlan, that were embodied in Mitzrayim, and the Lashon he uses is Bote Teatros V'Karkasois, obviously, the Chassam Sofer was using the terminology of his Deah in Austro-Hungary, where the Chassam Sofer was the leading loichem against the reformers, and the Jews, Rachman Latzlan, had already begun to assimilate. Similarly so, this is all patterned after Galus Mitzrayim. Once that happened, Katsu Mibnei Yisrael, they got disgusted with us, which followed with Havan Eschak Malai and all the other things which led to the terrible, bitter second half of Klal Yisrael's sojourn in Mitzrayim. Says some Sefer, this is the pshat in the pasuk, in Bilam's nevuah. Hein Am, when is Klal Yisrael nechshav as a nation? Levadad Yishkain, only when they are sheichin on their own. Ba'goyim, if they are nisarev in the goyim, lo yischashev, the goyim do not take us seriously, and we have now no importance to them, and therefore we would have the danger of fading away. This Rabbi say, ladies and gentlemen, and I say ladies because everybody knows that the high standards of kashrus that Klal Yisrael adheres to is very often, most often, certainly in my home, is a function of the great dedication of our Nashim Tzidkanias to making sure our kitchens are on the higher standards of kashrus. The problem, as we will hear in the next hour or so, is that A, there are multitudes of problems in the kitchens, but of course, given the aforementioned riboy of products that are manufactured in the large, vast industrial complex that produces food worldwide, that requires all sorts of very sophisticated programs, devices, and great amount of thought to make sure everything's on the higher standard of halacha. But we need to do this because already at the beginning of the Rishonim, Rashi says in the Sefer Apardis, in the end of Hilchos Bishul Akum, all these halachos are because v'iskadashtem v'yisem kedoshim l'shalem schachar toilet tzadikim ulihi para min harishayim, to pay us a schar that in order to tzadikim. And the Rama in Perigid Zion, in famous dicta, he says, Chol hanizar b'dvarim elu, anybody who is careful with these things, maybe kedusha v'tahara yiseir l'nafshay, brings big kedusha to his nefesh, u'memarek nafshay l'shem hakadosh baruch hu, he cleanses his nefesh, as the pasuk says, v'hiskadashtem v'hiyisem kedoshim. Someone who is Rachmana litzlan not nizar. So Rabbi in Shari Tshuva, in a well-known keta, it's in Shar Gimel Eisches, he says people are mezalzel in Netilas Yadayim and in other divrei chachamim, and they are pirates gathering things that they consider to be minor. They are considered Rachmana litzlan ram chatam l'Hashem ma'od va'achrisam adei oived. As Chazal say, Kol ha'over divrei chachamim chayiv misa. And this is only because Royal Eiv Perik El Shemayim Al Savaram, very, very difficult language, harsh language in the Shari Tshuva. And then he adds, Gamakat, that group, Asher Einam Nizarim Megvina Shel Gayim, Ubishul Gayim, they're not nizar from Gaish cheese or Bishul Gayim, because they are Mekel and Divrei Chachamim, even though it's only because of their own taiva. It's not considered to be a Isser of taiva. It's considered to be a bizayin, bazul divrei chachamim, v'shavru oil hatayra v'hamayra, and Rachmana litzlan, it's a over divrei chachamim chayiv misa. Rabbi say, this is very, very strong language by Rabbi Yaina, as one would expect. These are not just minor isurei rabbanan. These are very serious issues, and if you're not nizar in them, Rachmana litzlan, it leads to terrible things. In the Tshuvas Maram Rottenburg, there is a tshuva in which a shayel asked him, what is the importance of Bishul Akum? After all, many people are not nizar in Bishul Akum, says Maram Rottenburg. And that you say that there are some people who eat fish, Eitzel Agayim, and we're going to talk about fish a little bit later, several types of fish. He says, who says this is mutter? Lav mar bar Rashi chasam alay. There's no such a heter, and they are going to be asid litnes adin. There's a sefer called Nachal Eshkoil. The background of the sefer Nachal Eshkoil, which was written as a pirush to the sefer Eshkoil, is a story in itself. That's for another time. But he brings a ma'aser for any geras. We recommend it. And he says the following story. Rive and Shimon, two people, were in a ship in the Mediterranean, and the ship got shipwrecked. And they needed to return to land, and the closest land was Spain. And this took place during the period of the Inquisition, where one could not walk around, must have been in the 1400s, one could not walk around visibly as a Jew. These two brothers were shipwrecked, and they ended up, obviously, in a terrible situation. And Reuven and Shimon ended up in two different houses. They asked two people to take them in as refugees. I guess they tried to hide their Jewishness. And these Goyim were chemel on them. They were marachin on them. They gave them food to eat. And they restored them to health. Shimon ended up in a home too, similar so. And at some point, having restored them back to health, they matched notes. And they spoke to their hosts And it turned out that Ruvain, in his gesture to thank his host who had taken him in, and the host told him the following: I recognized that you are a Jew, even though you tried to cover it up. I want to tell you that I am also Jewish. His host was a Marano, and having recognized Reuven as a Jew, he told him, I'm also Jewish. I'm a Onus, and really we keep all the Torah b'Seiser. In my basement, underground, which you did not see, I am a Sheichet and Baidek. I shech behemoths. I am Nizer from Basar v'Chalav. And therefore, do not be upset that you ended up in my house. You thought you were eating tarfus. You were a B'Kloch Nefesh situation because you were shipwrecked. And I'm sure that they were close to death. But don't be upset, said his host, because Basar Pigul Leiba Beficha. You did not eat any Machalis Asuris. Shimon knew that he was hosted by a guy. And therefore, Beles Berer, he had to eat in Veilus and Trefus and Basar B'Chalav. He had to eat it because it was B'Kloch Nefesh. When Shimon came home, he went to his Rav and he asked him, why was he Nanash that he ended up in the house of a guy and Ruvain ended up in the house of a Jew? And he ate only kashrus. So the Rav told him, tell me. This Rav was obviously a very chashuv person, lived in the Zman of the Rishonim. We can't know who he was. But he told him, I want you to tell me the truth. Is it possible that sometime in your life you were nichshal in machalos asurais without a oines? And Shimon answered him, yes, it's true. There were times when I was young, and I was hanging out with my friends, and I saw them eating lechem, gvina, and yayin of nachrim, and I couldn't resist the taiva, and I tasted a little bit, and I'm asking Kadosh Baruch Hu to forgive me. Says the Chacham to him, Tzaddik Hashem b'chol derachav. Your friend Ruvain never was Tayyim Tam Yisr, and therefore Kadosh Baruch Hu was shomer him from many takala, many tsar v'oinis. But you, who are nichshal in the past in Machalas Asuris, you didn't have that protection, and therefore, when you ended up shipwrecked somewhere, you had to take refuge in the home of a guy. And even though you had no choice, and it was an einus, but Baruch Hu did not create this nest for you to end up in the home of a Marano who would only feed you basar kosher, and therefore you require a tshuva on the oven that you were nichshal Machalas Asuris both earlier. And even now, even though you were honest, it was me'ashem yatsa davar, there was a condition precedent, and therefore you have to do tshuva on both of these occasions. Adkan, the story has brought B'Shem the Yavitz. I want to conclude this introduction with mentioning a well-known and perhaps slightly chilling mimer of Mar Nagain of Shlomo Zalman Auerbach. This vart, which is a little bit atypical of Shlomo Zalman, those of you who are zeichet to know him personally or see him personally know that his panim was always tzayavais. He was always smiling, and he was always the picture of simchas hatayra. You don't associate strong divrei musar necessarily with him. But in his Sefer Halichos Shleima and Hilchais Aseres Meitshuva, I'm going to give you the exact site because it's worth seeing inside. It's Hilchais Aseres Meitshuva, Sefer Halichos Shleima, which is a compilation of his Anhagais and Halachais on Amud Membeis in Ha'ara 11. Again, Halichos Shleima and Aseres Meitshuva, Amud Membeis, Ha'ara 11. Says Shlomo Zalman, I'm going to tell you something about Bishul Akum. It's in the Aseres Meitshuva on the halacha of even someone who's not nizar and paspalter kol yomais hashana, because Ramah is mekel and paspalter should be nizar in the Aseres Meitshuva. Shlomo Zalman uses that opportunity to tell you his shita on Bishul Akum Bizmanenu. Says Shlomo Zalman. It's a terrible, terrible machla called Nisue Ta'aruvais, mixed marriages, which is destroying Klal Yisrael. Rachmana litzlan. And he says, Bifrat B'artzos Habris, in particular in America, which never before happened in the history of Klal Yisrael. And therefore it's incumbent upon us to try to figure out why this Ra Agudah happened to us. So he says, Chazal already told us. And Chazal told us that the reason that Goyim are always attempting to swallow us up, and the reason that Chazal created these Gzeiros of Pas and Bishul and Yain is to prevent this, as the Gemara in Avodah Zarah explains at length, and as brought in Shulchan Aruch Yeridea Simonim Kuf Yud Beis, which is Pas Akum, and Kuf Yud Gimel, which is Hilchos of Bishul Akum. Says Shlomo Zalman, instead of being Sheimer B'chol Oiz on these Gzeiros, unfortunately, we have become accustomed to look for all sorts of kulais, which are keneged the ratzain of Chazal. And even those who are in a position to be sheimer, kashrus, and a greater degree of hider, because in the Medinas of Chutz La'aretz, we are used to great kulais. The Lashon uses lahakel kulais gedeles b'yaiser. Saif davar, at the end of the day, einon nizarin ledavainenu karayu be'ilu ehanyanim. We are not nizar sufficiently in the yanei of machalis asuris and b'chali akum. And the raya barur to this is nesili taruvas. And that's why we have intermarriage. Chazal said, don't do this and you'll be protected. And we are not nizar, so therefore we are not protected. Even though we have put a huge amount of effort to prevent this, and the reason for this is because we are being mamshech le'echais b'chol oisen kulais shein hepach hagomem b'ratzon chazal b'tekanai sehem. If you learn the sugyas, and if you learn Shulchan Aruch Yeridea Kuf Yud Beis and Kuf Yud Gimel, you will see that Chazal did create certain gedarim in which they were mekel on Hilchais, Pas, and Bishul Akum, and they are legitimate. They are, in fact, with halacha, and there are several machlekes and well-known machlekes between the Mechaber and the Ramah, and Bnei Ashkenaz, who are yotzim biyad Ramah, paskin like the Ramah, and this is the anhag of Klal Yisrael for many generations. Says Rav Shlomo Zalman, that's fine. But really, the Eitzah to fight against intermarriage is leilech min hakatza el hakatza, to go from one extreme to the other. Ulahachmir ad makom sheyadeinu magas. Let's try to be machmer, even though we pass like the Ramah and we are not zuz from the Hayrois of the Ramah. Nevertheless, the lashon of Shlomo Zalman is kidai hatzolas Yisrael. It's important for Hatzolas Yisrael that we should. Even though it's difficult to be deichik, to force ourselves, even though Ramah was mekel and many things in Pas and Bishul, nevertheless, it's incumbent upon us, nachmer b'chol yonei Bishul Akum, kamat keshitas habeis Yosef. And then the editor, in a large parentheses, brings down several examples of his Havana of what Rav Shlomo Zalman meant, as to what type of kulais Chazal gave us and Ramah codified, but it would be better not to be noyeg api these kulais. We'll talk about those in a few minutes with our next guest, Rabbi Neustadt. However, be'emes, if achenu b'nei Yisrael will in fact yitnu el libam to understand the gadol hasakana, which is inherent in these kulais, yis'amtzu lahamid b'moinam u'mashgicham b'chol mifal o mifal. They will make sure to put mashgicham in each factory. Shiatakana taiva b'yaser. This is now referring to some of the aspects which we'll discuss on the operating level of how to produce food under tachas akashrus. Says Rav Shlomo Zalman, if we will be mainea from Bishul Akum, Yatzilu al yidei zeh ezera beis Yisrael arachaik mishmiras hatayra. In this chus of being nizar from Bishul Akum, we'll be able to save an entire generation of Klal Yisrael that is rachaik mishmiras hatayra mili tamei ben agayim ve'gadol secharan min hashamayim. There will be tremendous schar for this. Ad kan divrei Shlomo Zalman in stirring words printed at Lichus Shlema. A bibliographical note: this homily by Maran Pesach Adair created some controversy because it was taken in the Kashrus world as perhaps a little bit critical of the Kashrus organizations, and in subsequent Madurais of Lichus Shlema, it's not there. I met the editor this week at a chasana, actually of his own. He was marrying off a child. We discussed this, and it was generally agreed that it would be to restore this. In any case, the old prints have it, to restore this and all subsequent reprints of the Halichas Shlema. And I think Klal Yisrael is at the level now of investing hundreds of millions of dollars to make sure that we have kashrus alatzad yeser toiv. If Shlomo Zalman is being maftiach to us that this zihirus will stop intermarriage, kidaihu, the preservation of Klal Yisrael, for us to try to be machmer in these inyanim as much as we possibly can. Okay, everybody, say this is a introduction and perhaps a little bit of a insight into the importance of these inyanim. We are now going to bring on some of our mumchim, harabanim hagainim, who are going to discuss some of the specifics here, and we will begin with Hagayin Rav Doniel Neustadt, who will discuss specific inyanim kashrus. So we'll pose several questions to him. We'll try to cover as many topics as we can, given the time that we have. Thank you. Rabbi Neustadt, are you on the line?
Yes. Hello,
okay.
Rabbi Gottesman. How are you?
Fine, thank you. Okay, it's a privilege for me to be able to be in the same program with you. I just want to tell our tzibur of listeners that Rav Doniel was mezaka, the mishtatfim of the Agudah Yarchei Kallah, was serving as a in-house pesach in our week in Yerushalayim, and I was privileged to spend, as they say, quality time with him last week, and I was able to learn a lot, and I was able to watch as he was able to enlighten our Eilam with his insights into many of these complex issues. So I thank him for joining us here today. I'll just tell him, since I do not know if he was able to hear what was introduced, but we talked about the background of the chaymer of the Isser of Machale Akum and the great emphasis that Chazal and Rabbi Seino Rishayim and Achreinim put on this, and I concluded with outlining the stirring words of Rabbeinu Maran Ba'alichas Shlema and Michas Shlema of Shlomo Zalman on his unusual, at least for him, explanation as to why we have this terrible, terrible magefa of intermarriage, which is threatening to destroy Klal Yisrael, and his incredible haftacha that were we to be more machmer on certain of these inyanim, we in fact would be able to prevent this terrible magefa. I left open as to which kulais he was referring to. He generally refers to those places where there are maz mekel. We should be machmer. So I'm going to ask Hagayin Rav Doniel to enlighten us a little bit on some of these things, and the template we'll use for this is by starting with some issues negea to technology, the use of technology and its interface in Hilchos Bishul Akum. We'll start with what today is considered to be relatively low-tech, which is microwaves, and we'll move on to a relatively new innovation, and that's induction cooking. So, Rabbi Neustadt, if you can enlighten our Olam into what the possible halachic framework of microwaves and induction cooking, and then I think we'll move on to what you wished to discuss, or perhaps the parentheses, which I did not get into, in that Alicha Shlomo, of what Rabbi Shlomo Zalman may have meant when we talked about trying to be machmer even in those places where there are Mo's Mekel. Let's start with microwaves.
Okay, thank you very much. And I did have the opportunity to spend a week with the Agudah Yarchei Kallah. Truly an amazing experience, and with Hashem, we hope to do so in the future as well. As far as the question that you're asking about whether or not microwaves are an issue for Bishul Akum or not. So this is a question amongst the contemporary poskim, and maybe I'll spend a few minutes just to explain what the issue might be. The Shulchan Aruch writes very clearly, of course the Shulchan Aruch doesn't discuss microwaves, but the Shulchan Aruch writes very clearly, both the Mechaber and the Ramah, and nobody really argues with that the Gzeira, when Chazal said that Bishul Akum forbids the food to be eaten, they explicitly made that Gzeira only with the Bishul Shal Eish. That's the language of the Ramah. A Bishul that causes a fire to happen. Not heat, necessarily, but fire. Because that was the normal way that people cooked always, really. And that is what was considered Bishul. Bishul Shal Eish, of course, is included into that toiledos of Eish. In other words, whatever fire heats up, the fire will heat up a utensil, and you'll put the egg on the utensil, that will be also considered Eish or its derivative, a toiledo of Eish. But something, let's say you would do Bishul Bechama, if you cook it out in the sun, that's not considered Bishul Be'esh according to all opinions, and therefore that would not be a problem of Bishul Akum. And based on that criteria, the Shulchan Aruch writes that if you smoke something, even if you use hot smoke, if you use a very salty meluach, which normally is considered kereseach, it's considered as if you're bubbling something with the power of salt, sodium, also does not forbid Bishul Akum. It's got to be cooking, and cooking via fire. That is the language of the Shulchan Aruch, and that is agreed upon by all. The question is, based on that, it would seem, at least at first glance, that a microwave, which is in all opinions not fire, it's molecules which are being moved around through energy, through the electric power, but there's no actual fire taking place, it's no Eish, and it's not a teloda of Eish, it should not be a problem. That's where it should come out if you just follow the basic concept that the Shulchan Aruch introduces us Bishul Akum with. And indeed, some places can go with that, and they say that microwaves would not be a problem with Bishul Akum. There is, however, Rabbi Yashiv, amongst others, is quoted, at least Baal Peh, that he was strict with microwaves, and he held that it is a problem of Bishul Akum. And the explanation that's quoted, and again, this is not written down, so we have to go with what is told over to us in Pi Hashmua, is that he said that since today people cook with microwaves, it became derech bishul, it became a normal way of cooking, and therefore certainly this also goes under Chazal's gzeira, it's included in whatever bishul is. And since this is the way people cook, and therefore that's become to us a form of bishul nowadays, and that is also forbidden, even though it's not ish. That is the quote that Rabbi Yashiv and other great poskim held. It's a little bit difficult to understand, how that fits in with the language of the Shulchan Aruch. And apparently he must have held, again, we have to assume, that the Shulchan Aruch didn't care so much about Eish, but cared more about the standard form of cooking. Since this has become a standard form of cooking, and therefore certainly the Shulchan Aruch would have forbid that as well. So that is debatable and controversial. Some will hold this way, some will hold that way. And like any other machlekes, this has to be judged at the time of Chatchila. Of course, we avoid it. B'diavad or b'shas adchak. There's some room for leniency, and each situation will have to be decided by a competent posek.
Rabbi Doniel, I assume that when you say cooking, obviously warming something up is not included in that.
Right, I just want to add that also, that the whole microwave, that's right, that's a good point. The whole microwave issue is not that relevant. Most people do not use a microwave for cooking. we have to make very clear that to warm food which has been previously cooked, even though now it's frozen solid and it cannot be eaten, if you're using the microwave to defrost, to warm something up, to take a slice of pizza and cook it up, which has been cooked beforehand, all agree, that's no problem. Bishul Akum means cooking. Warming is not cooking. You're allowed to use your microwave when you're not actually cooking. So how many people, I mean, I would assume that it applies somewhat, but not that much cooking takes place in a microwave in a normal home, in a normal circumstances. So therefore, it's not such an applicable question. And besides that, it's hard really to understand why this has become derech bishul. I don't think it has become derech bishul. I think most people do not use a microwave for cooking under normal circumstances. It's a minority of people that use microwave for cooking. So it's hard to understand the argument of derech bishul, even though we find it in maybe Hilchos Shabbos, perhaps yes or not. But here it remains a question. And of course, one has to turn to his Rav for the final psak halacha.
I think it is a macro question here, which is perhaps beyond the scope of this discussion, of when cultural changes or mores in society undergo, obviously, transformations, when they become nitfas in halacha. As you said, what's derech bishul? How is it exactly calculated? If a certain amount of people will use it on a trip to cook some food, does that make it derech bishul just because it's possible, or do you need to have it a Rive the amount of people? How does something come into halacha, given the fact that quote unquote people do it that way? What are the gedarim for that? I think that would be
usually we go by what's become a common form of cooking. If this is
commonly
used, doesn't have to be right. No, it has to be common. It's not a numbers game. It has to be common. I don't think it's common. I may be wrong. I don't know. I don't use a microwave for cooking. My family doesn't. I don't think it's a common thing to do. But it doesn't have to be right. It has to be common. But in addition to that, see, when it comes to Hilchos Shabbos, Rabbi has a well-known tshuva that the microwave is considered derech bishul. He says it's going to be. He wrote that tshuva in the very early years, where before microwaves were common. But he predicted that it's going to be in every kitchen. It's going to be used all the time. And therefore, he says it's bishul midoraisa concerning Hilchos bishul. But the difference is that in Shabbos, derech bishul is a criteria. That is the criteria of bishul for Shabbos, derech bishul asur Torah. Here in Bishul Akum, we don't find that language in the Poskim. As a matter of fact, the Ramah goes out of his way to say, Lo asur el bishul shel eish. He doesn't say Lo asur el derech bishul. It's not his terminology. That's not the criteria that the Ramah is using. And that's why it's difficult to understand, even if you were to argue that it is derech bishul, which is questionable, but even if you were to still, the Ramah explains this halacha as a bishul shel eshidin to the exclusion of anything else. So that's why this makes it difficult from 2 points of view. Either it's derech bishul or not, and secondly, even if it is, who said that changes the criteria? That's why it's a shayla in the poskim, and there are different views.
And therefore, Lamaisa, even though one could theoretically be mekel, and I'll give a very common scenario with older people who have akum caregivers. This is certainly in Eretz Yisrael, Filipinos, and here in America, to have something which is pre-cooked, to have something which isn't cooked occasionally, they'll need to do so for older people. Yesh makom lahakol, is that a fair statement? But yes,
yesh makom lahakol for elderly people.
Right. But however, if we can, and this, I guess, falls under that dicta of Shlomo Zalman, if you can, since there are chasher rabbanim who are machmer, one should try to be machmer if possible. Is that a fair sum up?
Right. That is a fair way to do it. But sometimes we find ourselves in a situation where it's very difficult. Or another applicable case would be b'diavad. What would be if a non-Jew did cook something in a microwave for the Jew? Does that make the microwave treif? That's a good question. Can it be eaten b'diavad if that's all there is for supper at that point, or a hefsed situation?
Let's put you on the spot and answer that question, please, for us.
I tell you, I would, in most cases, I would be mekel, I would be lenient, and I would be mitzaref, I would add that there is a well-known machlokes in the Rishonim whether or not Bishul Yisrael is an issue in a Jew's home. Some Rishonim hold, Taisus brings down in the name of some Rishonim, that only in the non-Jew's home was the initial gzeira of Bishul Akum made. That's when they were worried about the potential pitfalls that brought them to do Bishul Akum. But in the home of the Jew, some Rishonim hold that we do not have Bishul Akum concerns at all. Although the basic halacha does not follow those Rishonim, and we tend to be machmir, we tend to be stringent with that. But the Poskim agree, the Chachos Adam and the Taz and others say that when you have other tzirufim, when you have other questions, other shilas and Hilchos Bishul Akum, you can rely on the lenient view and allow Bishul Akum in a home of a Jew, b'diavad, of course, only b'diavad. So therefore, if such a story were to happen, and it would happen in a Jew's home, where the caretaker cooked supper for them, I would certainly be combining these two questions together and relying on the Shitus HaMekilim. So that would be one aspect of that.
Okay, Yeshurun, let's step up the technological ladder and let's move to something called induction cooking. I think it's done on a stovetop. I think it would be important for the Rav to explain the Metzias. I will add that we spent a very fascinating hour last week in the Chitzasai of one of the Gedalia Paiskim of Ardar, Adain Rav Moshe Sternbach, the Baal Tshuvas Vahanagais, and one would assume that perhaps senior Paiskim, like Zunstein, I believe he is Kanayan Arad Mev Esr, 94 years old. They wouldn't necessarily be up on all the technological advances, but the answer is if you're going to paskin these type of shilas, you have to really, really know the Metzias. And we were all fascinated to see that the Metzias discussion was on very high level. So I would ask Harav Doniel if you could kind of enlighten the Eilim as to how this thing works, and let's try to apply the halacha.
Okay, so induction cooking is a little bit more complex than the microwave, which everybody has in their own home. Although I've been told that it's the wave of the future. In the future, that's how people are going to be cooking in their own home. So therefore, this would be more derech bishul. I don't know if it is already now. It might be now, but it's certainly in the future. This is the way to go because the kitchens get a lot less hot with this. Essentially, what it is, I did see it once in actual how it works. Essentially, you have a stovetop, and you first turn on, when you want to use it, you turn on the power, but nothing happens. The power does nothing, it's completely cold. When you're ready to cook, you take the pan or the pot. Now, it doesn't work with all pans or pots. It has to be a pan or pot that has in it some real steel, stainless steel. And then you put that pan or pot on this stovetop, on this induction cooktop, and together the electromagnetic field is moved around with the power. The electrical current moves around the electric magnetic field. That creates a friction, which creates a heat, which then cooks the food very rapidly. It's much faster than normal conventional cooking. That is the basic description of the induction cooking process.
So do I understand correctly, excuse me a second, do I understand correctly that, again, we have an issue where it's not actually a use of Aish, but it's a use of magnetics? Why don't we talk about that for a second?
Yes, it is. And at least the way I understand it, and I'm not a scientist, but the way I understand it, there is no Aish. There's no fire. There's the heat, there's power, there's electrical power, of course, which moves around the magnetic field, and that creates that friction, which creates heat. There is no fire. There's heat, but there's no fire. Just like a microwave, there's heat, but there's no fire.
If I can add the definition if you don't mind, the definition that the manufacturers will use is induction cooking uses electromagnetic energy to heat pots and pans directly. In comparison, gas and electric cooktops heat indirectly using a burner and passing radiant energy onto your food. This does not do that. It heats it directly, and as you can imagine, it's far more efficient to heat cookware directly instead of indirectly. So The secular definition somehow makes it direct and indirect. Does that have any halachic significance?
Well, I think that when we say indirect, it means that there's a burner which, produces fire. That fire heats up the pot, and then that pot heats up the food. That's what makes it indirect. It's almost like a koyach shlishi. The fire to the pot to the pot. Over here, it's direct. It's direct. That's what it means. It doesn't go through the pot. The pot itself doesn't even get hot. The food gets hot.
Right.
So therefore,
in fact, I'm told that if you put your finger on an induction cooktop, it won't burn. You will not actually feel the heat. It's fascinating.
Well, guess why? Because there's no fire.
There's no fire, but there is extreme heat. It's very interesting.
There's heat on the food. The food gets hot.
Right.
It's similar, by the way. I believe it's similar to a microwave. Also, the food gets burning hot, but the walls generally won't. Right. You're not going to burn yourself if you put your finger inside a microwave oven.
Right,
so
but the scientific process is somewhat different because in the microwave, the waves find some liquid within the food, no matter how minuscule it is, and moves that around, and that's where the heating process comes from. That's why the inside of food in our microwave gets hotter than the outside. But so what's the halachic construct?
So I don't think there's any halachic difference between them. So since there's no fire, if you read the Ramah simply, if you want to stay with basic halacha, there should not be a problem of Bishul Akum with induction cooking as well. Should not be. Here, though, I can hear two potential problems that we don't have with the microwave. First of all, this is, or like I said before, this would be derech bishul. This is normal cooking. This is how people cook dinner. It's not like mostly used for warming and once in a while remotely used for cooking. This is cooking. If you want a chicken, you want meat, you want your fish, that's how you would cook it, and therefore that would be really derech bishul. And since that's going to be the way of the future, so it's going to be the common way of derech bishul. So therefore, those poskim who forbid microwave would certainly forbid induction. Certainly. No question. But the question still remains, in my opinion, that if you strict with the letter of the words of the Ramah, that it's only Eish, perhaps it would not make Bishul Akum there either. So that remains a shaila, and over here, you have to be machmir a little bit more, but still there's room b'diavad or b'shasat chak to be making, at least in my opinion.
And since this is still unfolding, if in fact the marketers do what they want, what they wish to do, and make it standard de rigueur in all from kitchens of the future, it obviously will become more and more derech bishul, and then you may have to change somewhat your opinion. So this is an example how technology and the changing behavioral standards of society has an impact on halacha. We're always looking to be as strict as we can, certainly as in these issues, but it is totally in the mitzias of what people do. Okay, so if I can sum up your psak in induction cooking, it's more derech bishul because that's how it's being marketed and sold. It's more derech bishul than a microwave. It's used to cook. The halachic question is whether there is asher, whether that would be a kula. It would be more chomer than a microwave. Anybody who passes a microwave asers this, but still, b'shasat chak, there will be yesh makam lahakal, and call your Rav or your Pesach to see what exactly that constitutes. Is that a fair summary?
Yeah. Right. Yes, that's a fair summary.
Very good. Okay. Let's move on now to a couple of other issues. The Rav mentioned earlier about what happens when we brought up the question of a caregiver for an older person. What happens if they went ahead and cooked? Is there a requirement? What do you do with the food? And is there a requirement to throw it out? Let's talk about some of those questions. When do you actually have to do that, and when can you use the food b'diavad? Give us some of the parameters for that.
Okay. So, like we said before, really we need to determine where the activity took place. If it took place in what the halacha calls Beis Yisrael, in the home of the Jew, and l'chayra, pashtus, it would include a Jewish-owned restaurant, a Jewish-owned caterer, a Jewish-owned nursing home. In other words, if it's owned by a Jew, this is called Beis Yisrael. It's a little bit of a bigger Beis Yisrael than a regular standard home. But as long as it's owned by a Jew, So then we have this fallback position that b'diavad, if something were to take place, then we could use that with a tziruf. In other words, we don't rely on that alone, but we rely on other factors as well. So, for instance, let's say you brought up the case of a housekeeper. There's another, and let's say she cooked supper for the elderly person or even for the family. I've had recently, just a couple of months ago, I had a case, a lady called me up that she goes away to work. She has a housekeeper. She lives by her already. She's already by her over 6 months. Her father-in-law lives by them, and he's a big tzaddik, she told me. And the housekeeper turned on the crock pot for the supper to be cooked, so that when the family's ready to eat, when the wife comes back home, she doesn't have to work. And normally she never did it before, but this one time she put on the crock pot. Came 6 o'clock, everybody's ready to eat. Then they realized the housekeeper is the one who put it on, actually cooked a full-fledged supper for them. So it wasn't a microwave situation. It was a real cooking, a crock pot, which is a regular pot, and it was cooked by the non-Jewish housekeeper. And this was supper time. So it was a little bit of a crisis. So the answer, the way we can deal with this in a b'diavad situation will be to combine two kulas. Kula number one here would be Beis Yisrael. This was done in the house of the Jew, and some Rishonim are mekel, and we relied that with another tziruf, with another combination of another kula. The other kula that will be available here is there's a sheet. The Shulchan Aruch says that shvachas haschures. If a person has a maid, shvcha haschura, a hired maid who did this Bishul Akum, then according to some Rishonim, even if it wasn't in the Beis Yisrael, even if it wasn't necessarily in the house of the Jew, it's independent of that svara. But if it was a shifcha haschurel on it, if it was a maid which is being paid and is hired by us, so then the halacha is a Bishul Akum doesn't apply. They only did it with friends. They don't want you to associate with your friends. They don't want you to associate with your neighbors so that there shouldn't be intermarriage. But with a shifcha schura alanu, that's not an intermarriage situation in most cases. And therefore Chazal's Gzera was not stretched that far. We don't really paskin like that shita either. We're machmer and we hold that Bishul Akum applies to household help as well. However, when we have both of these situations, like we did in that particular case in Monsey, where it was Beis Yisrael, plus it was a household worker that's been there for months. So then we have both of these kulas. When we have both of these kulas, then the Chachmas Adam paskins that b'diavad we can be makel and we can allow the food to be eaten. And that is what I told that family. I told them it's a kula. It's not, it's not lechatchilas certainly. It's not something that should happen. You should not allow it to do it. But if this is what you have for supper and this is what you have to eat, the basic halacha permits you to eat that food, and it's not b'diavad, it's not considered bishul akum. That would be one way of dealing with a b'diavad situation, but you have to have at least those two kulas in order to be able to do so. Or any, yeah.
Since we're talking about kulas, let's raise this interesting question of the shita of the Marat Sahalon, which has become somewhat a question of halachic contention here. So we'll give the background and I'll have the Rav comment on it. There is a Das Yachid in the Gedolei Achronim, which says that food that is manufactured in a factory is not applicable. The Isser of Bishul Akum does not apply to it, because since the side of the Isser is chasnus, we do not wish to become too close to the goyim and thereby become nisarev, as we discussed. Food which is manufactured institutionally, which has no direct correlation to the person making the food, and therefore you're not going to have any interaction with them, the Isser of Bishul Akum would not apply. So this shita was kind of dormant, if I may say, throughout the last couple of centuries, and then it became very important. Obviously, factories are even more rachik from our day-to-day existence than they were in that time. The food that you eat is very likely manufactured thousands of miles away, and in numerous different plants. And therefore, Rav Moshe is quoted. This is not printed in the Igros Moshe. Rav Moshe is quoted as saying that there is such a kula. It was quoted by Rabbi Griblat B'Shem the Rive Ephraim, his brother, that he heard it directly from Rav Moshe, and Rav Moshe acquiesced to this. That one can be mitzaref this kula under certain circumstances. Those circumstances being that the manufacturing process has to be totally different in kind, not just degree, than your home kitchen. You can't just have a bigger pot. It has to have machines that you couldn't possibly have any nexus to. And under certain circumstances, one could be mitzaref this kula. Is this kula used, Harav Doniel, and under what circumstances can it be used?
Yeah. So, yes, this kula of Rav Moshe, I've done many years ago. I did some research about it, and then I had the chus to meet Rav Notte Greenblatt over at one of the Agudah Yarchei Midwest conventions a number of years ago. He's actually an uncle of the Rive Ephraim. And I asked him what exactly Rav Moshe said on this Nakuda. I asked him that in public, so it's actually recorded. And he answered more or less along the lines that you said, because I've heard Rav Moshe quoted different ways, but this psak was given to Rav Notte Greenblatt many years ago, and he said clearly, it's only in a situation where the appliances, the equipment that's being used cannot be duplicated in the Jewish home. It's an assembly line type of a situation, such machinery that normal homes do not have. So then we don't say, the lumdus of that is, because in general he did not rely on the Maharitatz, on the Maharitza alone, because once Chazal made Xera, they didn't differentiate. We don't find the pas pauter heter for Bishul, that was special only for bread. So since they did not invoke it for Bishul, so therefore it applies to factories as well. However, he said, that is only to manufacturing equipment that could possibly also be done by a Jew at his home, and by a non-Jew at his home. So therefore, they made a Xera that covers all kinds of situations. But if it cannot possibly be duplicated by a non-Jew at his home, so the fact that the factory has such a machine, but regular non-Jews cannot do so, will take away the loy plug factor, and we could assume that Chazal would not have made the Xera under those circumstances, and therefore the Xera was never given. This is the way he explained it. And the minig in the kashrus world today is to rely on the svara, but only with a tziruf of other svaras. We do not rely on that alone. In other words, at least certainly not the chatchila. Whether b'diavad we could rely on that will depend on different kashrus agencies and their standards. But to my knowledge, nobody relies on this kula alone. But when they have this kula plus other kulas like tuna fish and other things like that, so then some agencies would rely on it and some will not. That is what I know about the minig in America about this kula.
I will say that last week in Ma'oinai Shel Agudah Moshe Sternbach, he made it very clear that this is included in Ilu Hadvarim Shebein Bavel L'Eretz Yisrael. That in Eretz Yisrael they have not accepted this kula, and the way he writes and the way we heard it from again, even as a tziruf to a package of kulas. And the reason for that is because the Chazon Ish, even though again this is somewhat b'piyah shmua, it's not 100% clear in the Chazon Ish. It's in a letter which was printed only about 25 years ago in one of my Torah journal competitors, where the Chazon Ish says very clearly to be machmer and not to use this kula of the Meritz Salon even as a tziruf to other kulas, and therefore he says in Eretz Yisrael, and certainly as the Paisuk the Charedis, I assume the Badatz follows this, not to be mitzaref this kula at all. But I have a curious question going back to your scenario of the crock pot. Let's assume that what was cooked in that crock pot consisted of some factory manufactured foods, but she may have made a stew, let's say, which contained fresh vegetables too. So there you have a mixture of factory manufactured food, but you also have other things which are not manufactured in a factory. Obviously, other Gedarm of Bishul Akum may apply, Nechal Kamei Shuchai. How do you sort out those complicated questions when you have a mixture of different things? How would that?
Well, in that particular case was chicken and potatoes, so we couldn't. That wouldn't have applied there.
Oh, we could talk about potatoes at great length. Hashem. Okay, I will do so with your colleague Rabbi Gerstein. We're going to talk about all sorts of potatoes ending up in the White House, Mir Hashem, in the next segment of our discussion. Okay, let's move on here a little bit. Thank you very much for that, as always, illuminating response. So if I can sum up this question of how one treats food, which may have been inadvertently cooked under Bishul Akum. Again, this is a question of L'chatchila and B'diavad. L'chatchila, one should be nizer in this, and if you can replace it, you can. B'diavad, given the exigencies, there are certain ways to be mekel, and it's usually a requirement of a tziruf of various kulas. One kula on its own generally doesn't work. And the Rav has to put together the details of each case to see whether or not there is makam l'hakol. Is that a fair statement?
Right. A fair statement. You just have to add that as far as the kalim are concerned, it's also a further question whether or not a kalim that a non-Jew cooked in, do they actually become treif? Or do we just say that they do not have a power to make a kli treif? In other words, Chazal said that you're not allowed to do it, and you're not allowed to eat the food, but not necessarily did they also say that the utensils used in the process become non-kosher. This is a well-known machlokes rishonim, and while we tend to be machmir, we do our stringent certainly lechatchila, but it's part of the tzirufim that can be used sometimes with other tzirufim not to be forced to kasher those utensils under certain circumstances. Certainly if it's a kli cheres, which cannot be kashered, then we would be even more lenient, unless we would make Hagala 3 times. There are different options then, but it's part of the entire equation concerning what to do with the kalim once they were used.
What we do with a crockpot?
A crockpot, you can't really kasher a crockpot. But the Shulchan Aruch writes that there is a shita of the Bala Itur that allows Hagala 3 times on a klicheres under normal circumstances. In other words, even let's say a regular klicheres became treif with chazer. So generally we hold that you cannot do hagala on the klicheres. The bala'iter shita is that if you do hagala shloisha pa'amim, changing the water each time, so then you could do hagala on the klicheres. Generally, we do not paskin like the bala'iter. We do not. It's brought down in the Torah, but we do not paskin like that. However, in Bishul Akum, since it's essentially Gzer d'Rabbanan and not an inherent machalas asuris like chazer and basar b'chalav and these other things, so then we would rely on the Bala Itza Shita to do Hagala 3 times on any klicheres that became treif through the process of Bishul Akum. That is halacha l'maisa. So you would have an option in that case.
Okay, excellent. Yeshukayach. And again, obviously it depends on the type of the kli and the exigencies of what led to this, and therefore a shayla has to be asked. Let me conclude here with 2 pretty difficult questions here. We have time for 2 more topics. And it is Yoreh to ask this of our Rabbi Doniel because these are sensitive and complicated questions. Earlier we alluded to the approach of Shlomo Zalman on how, even though Rabbi Seinu, as codified in Shulchan Aruch and the Ramah, gave us certain kulas in Bishul Akum, it would be wise not to use these kulas. And I mentioned to the Eilam of Doniel that there is a bracket, a footnote in this Halicha Shlomo, which of course is somewhat Pia Shmua. I did speak to the editor of Halicha Shlomo this week, and he told me that he has it on tape. He's in Rabbinical. He has it on tape from his grandfather, Shlomo Zalman. So it's absolutely verified that Shlomo Zalman said it. What's not 100% clear is what kulas he was alluding to. Let's talk a little bit about the various approaches that some of the kashrus organizations have, because, as I mentioned in the introduction, one of the major organizations is OU Kosher that we interacted with last week. Incredibly enough, gives hechsherim to over 1 million products. I mean, that's a number which I find to be almost incomprehensible. 1 million products, which requires very sophisticated planning in order to conform to halacha as much as we possibly can, and perhaps not to indulge in some of these kulas. What could Rav Shlomo Zalman have been referring to in his request to us to be machmer? And I'll add that last week, Rav Sternbuch made it quite clear that, in America, maybe we should think about some of the things that we do and try to adhere to the standards of Eretz Yisrael. What are some of the issues that come up in the manufacturing process?
Well, according to the transcript that I saw from Rav Shlomo Zalman's tape, he did not say explicitly what he meant, but the writer, whoever was interviewing him for that at that particular time, understood him to talk about the ongoing controversy about glow bars and light bulbs. There are some kashrus agencies in the United States of America, reputable agencies, that allow Bishul Yisrael to take place by the mashgiach installing a glow bar into the oven, plugs it into an electrical power source, and it turns on, and the Jew puts that on, and that remains on until, for a long time. It can remain on for a month, 2 months, 3 months, until the next time the mashgiach happens to come around. And that, according to these certain kashrus agencies, they figure that makes the oven Bishul Yisrael, because part of the energy, which will also eventually be part of the heats that will be cooking the food, has been turned on by Yisrael. And this is based on the shita of many Rishonim that hold that hashlachas kisam, if you throw in even a small little stick, small little thorn of wood, a piece of wood, small, almost insignificant small piece of wood, as long as that's done by a Jew, that is also considered Bishul Yisrael. Despite the fact that most and the majority of the fire was turned on by the guy, but any small throwing in of the additional splinter of wood is sufficient. So therefore the argument goes that what's the difference if you throw in a splinter into the wood, into the fire, or if you turn on a glow bar or even a light bulb that has heat into the fire and therefore is part of the cooking process. There are agencies in America that rely on that, even to take care of the Bishul Akum problem. It's more commonly used, at least in my experience, to take care of Pas Yisrael. In other words, because Pas Palter essentially a lot of people permit anyway. There are many people that are makpid about Pas Yisrael, so there are agencies out there that, in order to get it to Pas Yisrael standards, will rely on the glow bar, whereas they would not rely on it for Bishul. Since Bishul is more strict and it's more Asur and Hadin, so they would not rely on it for Bishul, but they would rely on it for Pas. And yet, the position of the OU and other agencies, and certainly all of the kashrus agencies in Eretz Yisrael, do not rely on a glow bar or a light bulb at all. They differentiate between a glow bar and the throwing in of the splinter into the wood, which the Shulchan Aruch permits. And essentially the explanation, what is the difference? Really, one could argue, what is the difference? What's the difference if it's a glow bar or if it's a splinter? So there could be two differences. There could be two arguments why to say that there's a difference. One is the splinter is thrown into the actual fire. The piece of wood that's thrown by the mashgiach is part of the fire. It becomes a chelik of the entire fire. The glow bar never becomes part of the fire. The light bulb always remains distinct and essentially separate from this actual fire or heat that is cooking the food. And therefore, perhaps one could argue it's not the exact same scenario. You're not combining the fires by throwing something in. That's one argument. The other argument, which Rav Balsky was very strong about, and perhaps that's what Rav Zalman alluded to as well, although that's not certain, but it's perhaps. The other argument is that the Shulchan Aruch permits throwing in a splinter to kasher a non-Jewish fire. So if the guy put on the fire, and therefore right now it's Bishul Akum, the Jew may come and throw in that piece of wood into that fire, and that fire now becomes kosher. Whereas in the situation of the glow bar, it happens before. In other words, the oven is off. The Jew turns on the glow bar, then comes the non-Jew and puts on the energy source, which actually is going to bake or cook the food. So Rabbi Belsky held that it doesn't work that way. It only works by koshering the fire. You cannot do so in advance. This remains a point of contention. Those other agencies that permitted disagree with that, both of these distinctions, and they claim that a light bulb and a glow bar is the exact same thing like hashlochas kisam, whereas others find chilukim and therefore they're a machmer. So this is perhaps what Rosh Zalman meant when he said that it's a kula that we should try to avoid. And in my opinion, what he was saying is that the more we are machmir in Hilchos Bishul Akum, the more we recognize the idea behind Chazal's philosophy. This is a reminder to us. It's a hecker. It's a simon. If we are more careful about it, it's something that wakes us up and tells us, "Hey, why aren't we eating this? Oh, we're not eating this because it's Bishul Akum. Well, what's wrong with Bishul Akum? Bishul Akum is there to protect us from assimilation from intermarriage." So it serves as a constant reminder of the philosophy of what Chazal intended to do to us with this Gzeir of Bishul Akum.
So I'm going to add two nukudas, one a micro point on this question of what Rabbi Zalman was referring to, and perhaps this is no longer the Gei Lamaisa, because one of the speculative questions that he may have been referring to was the use of pilot lights in which basically are dependent on the Ramaz Kula in Kufyud Gimel Sifra Zayin, where if a Nachri was madlik an Eish Mitaich Eish Shal Yisrael, which means if a Eish was turned on by a Jew and then the fire was subsequently lit from that Eish by a guy, the Ramah is Mekel. And that's really how a pilot light works. And that is perhaps what Shlomo Zalman was referring to, because for many decades, as when I was growing up, and when Rav Doniel was growing up, that was in common usage in our homes, and people were assigned on that all the time, and of course, so too in the industrial setting. Pilot lights at home are no longer an issue because we're now dealing with induction cooking. Pilot lights have gone the way of dinosaurs, but that's perhaps one of the things that he was referring to. On what Rav Doniel mentioned earlier with Hashlachas Kisim, at the end, he referenced in passing, and this really is a subject of another entire discussion when it comes to technology in Bishul Akum, and I have graciously the editors and organizer of this forum have agreed to give us another shot at this at another time because it's a complex issue. I'll just mention it superficially to know that these questions exist in the manufacturing process, where the kashrus organizations really have to work hard to adhere to halacha. Obviously, at home you are more in control, but once we're talking about the highly automated and highly far-flung, as I said, over a million by one kashrus organization alone, they have to work hard and to keep abreast of technology. So, Rav Doniel mentioned that the lashon of the Rambam is codified in the Mechaber in Kufyud Gimel, that the hashlachas kisim, the throwing into the chip of the wood, is mishum heker, and for the reasons he explained a moment ago. Let's posit here just a couple of questions. I won't answer them, but to throw them on the table, where heker may come into it, and one of them which we discussed with Rav Sternbach last week. It's a interesting innovation was introduced about 10, 15 years ago in the kashrus world by Rav Yehuda Shein, a well-known Baal Machshir who lives in Lakewood. Many people know him or of him. And he came up with the following hamtza'ah. A cell phone with a code is used by a mashgiach. He punches a code into a cell phone, and that enables him to turn on the complex machinery in a factory thousands of miles away. Is this considered to be Bishul Yisrael or not? It needs to be Bishul Yisrael because other parts of the food manufacturing process are still Bishul Akum. Goyim load food into conveyor belts. Is this considered to be a sufficient turning on of the oven, even though you are many, many thousands of miles away? So this question was asked of the contemporary Paiskim. The leading Paisik in America, Agudah Yisrael Belsky, was matir, and Rabbi Yashav in Eretz Yisrael was matir too. And the question is, why? After all, where do we have a hecker This is taking place thousands of miles away. All of a sudden, the machine just starts up. And who's there to see it? And why is this considered a hacker? This is an interesting question which requires a lumdische explanation of what Rabbeinu Harambam, how he saw this into the sugya of Ashlachas Kissim and the machlekes between Bnei Bavel and Bnei Ma'ariv and how it's codified in the Paiskim. But I'll just let you know that this maneuver, this Shane maneuver, which is relied upon by the major kashrus organizations, even many in Eretz Yisrael with the validation of Eliashiv. Last week we heard from Moshe Sternbach that the Badatz does not rely on this. Why is that? Because according to Moshe Sternbach, the hacker that Rav Doniel referred to as codified in Kuf Yud Gimel requires, Lashon he uses is a haker rabba, a very, very big hacker, and therefore he feels that turning on a machine from thousands of miles away is not sufficient. It's just not a hacker, and it's not enough to induce the kind of thought process which Rav Doniel mentioned earlier, that a person should think, hey, the reason why this is being done is to keep me away from Bishul Akum and therefore keep me away from Goyim. So this is just one, this is relatively low-tech issue which is currently shanoi in a machlekes between the contemporary Paiskim. As I mentioned, many of the senior Paiskim are mat to this because they feel it's a direct action, it's not even a grama. Turning on something with a phone would certainly be Asur and Shabbos, so therefore it could create Bishul Yisrael. Moving up the technological ladder for a further discussion would be voice recognition using the cloud, the internet cloud, to turn on machinery, and even such things such as neural recognition. Soon, not too distant far away, we're going to be dealing with the use of autonomous cars in halacha. I just had an occasion to speak to a guy named David Bleich, who's one of our leading paiskim on all issues related to science and technology, and he told me he's writing a tome, a very large and chashuv article on halachais of autonomous cars. Looking forward to that not too distant future when that will be available. So too, neural technology. Who knows? Maybe within 10 years he'll be able to think and turn on machinery, and that, of course, will require the paiskim to speak to that. While I was in Eretz Yisrael, while Harav Doniel and I were zeichet to be learning together last week, after we raised some of these questions, a young man came over to me and said, let me show you something. Took out his phone. I wouldn't say it was a phone that met the tachlis hakashus and hidur of the Eretz Yisrael mazgichim, who in addition to giving hechsherim on hundreds of thousands of products, also give hechsherim on phones. This was a phone that was, let's put it this way, it was used for business uses. He turns on the phone, he shows me a picture live of his kitchen in London. He's an English young man. And he said, watch this. He's spoken to his phone, and he said, turn on the oven, and lo and behold, his oven, I was able to watch on his phone as his oven in London turned on. So this is an interesting question. Will this constitute Bishul Yisrael? Is this enough of a hacker to make it a Bishul Yisrael? And these are just some of the types of technological questions which currently exist and the Paiskim have to discuss as they unfold. Okay, let's conclude here with another difficult question, and that is the question which shorthandedly people call the Starbucks question. Is it mutter to drink coffee, A, mebchinas Bishul Akum, and B, mebchinas entering those type of establishments such as Starbucks, which clearly aren't necessarily Jewish establishments? What is the contemporary halachic view on such something which obviously is negate to every single person? Rav Doniel.
Okay, so those two subjects can be dealt with relatively easily. So let's see. The first thing that you mentioned was whether or not there's a Bishul Akum problem with using Starbucks coffee. Obviously, it's well known that obviously it has kosher items and non-kosher items. Not everything in Starbucks is kosher, so we're not discussing the non-kosher items, but the kosher items can be Bishul Akum because the coffee and other beverages are prepared by a non-Jew. So whether or not coffee is a Bishul Akum problem is an age-old question. It's been dealt by Poskim for a long time. And there were, and there probably still are, some opinions on both sides of the issue. But in this case, we invoke the Yerushalmi's rule that b'makom she'en halacha brura b'yadcha, puk lebar, go outside to the street and see the minhag ha'olam. And the minhag ha'olam is clearly in the side of being lenient and not to consider making coffee as a Bishul Akum situation. There are numerous svaros and explanations why coffee is not considered cooking by a goy, and those svaros have been dealt with the poskim. And like I said, the minhag has become by almost everywhere that we do buy coffee brewed by non-Jews, and we do not consider it to be a Bishul Akum problem. There's room for chumrah if somebody wants to be stringent on a personal basis. I'm sure there's room to be machmer. But as far as a hayurah on the rabbin to pass in the shayla for the public, coffee is not considered a Bishul Akum problem, and that is relatively dealt with in an easy way. The second issue that you mentioned is walking into Starbucks because, as we said, it has non-kosher ingredients. Well, perhaps there might be a maris ayin issue, but not really, because since it also has kosher products, and if the coffee is kosher and the other items there are kosher, so then it's not maris ayin. Maris ayin is only where it's clearly that you're going to be transgressing. But if it's maybe you're going to be transgressing, if you're going into a situation where it could be explained either this way or that way of what exactly you're doing in Starbucks, Rabbi has a tshuva about that, other poskim as well. We do not consider that to be a maris ayin situation. When we invoke, have it done as kol adam l'kafschus, probably you're there for a kosher product, and therefore that will also not be the great potential problem. The real issue with Starbucks is the fact that we don't know for certain that the actual coffee may actually be drunk. And not because the ingredients of the coffee are a problem, because all coffee is kosher, especially if it's not, all non-flavored coffee is kosher, it doesn't need a hechsher. But the real problem with Starbucks, which might be a problem, is that there's all kinds of non-kosher food there, chazer, basar b'chalav, real non-deraisa treif food in the area. And in the end of the day, or sometime during the day, the equipment that is used to make the coffee, the barista, the brewing utensils that are used, and the non-kosher utensils which were used to cook and serve tray food are washed, and they most probably are washed together in yatz and letters by hot water, sometimes with soap, sometimes without soap. Starbucks has this three sink compartment policy where they wash the dishes in 3 compartments. The first one, which is yatz and letters by water, all the dishes are thrown together with soap in the first sink, and they're rinsed off. Then they're taken out and put into the middle sink in yatz and letters by water without soap. At that point, with no soap there, so there's a serious concern that the blia, whatever has been imbued into the non-kosher kalim, will now transfer through heat. The heat will transfer over that non-kosher taste, that tam, into the kosher kalim that are used to make your coffee. This is ben yoimai, because it was used that day with hot treif, and now that tam is being transferred over to the kosher utensils that are being used to make your coffee. That is a serious halachic question. It's not 100% usher. There are ways how we can deal with it. This transfer is taking place in a klisheni situation, because the sink is a klisheni where this hot water is in. There are shittas that hold that b'diavad klisheni is not mavliya, it doesn't transfer over time from one kli to another. But it's hard to know. The thing that people don't remember is we don't have a mashgiach in Starbucks. They're not under hashgacha. We don't know what goes on exactly. And even if 5-6 years ago some agencies made some kind of an inspection of some Starbucks, stuff changes all the time. Their protocol changes, their procedures changes, their workers change. They don't always follow the rules. We don't have an exact picture of what's happening and every Starbucks. We do know that it is a place full of chazer treif deraisa food that comes in contact with all the other utensils that are there, and it's perhaps a kosher situation. Perhaps not. It's hard to say. Anybody who says that Starbucks is osur is wrong, because you can't say that for sure. On the other hand, if you say it's mutter and there's no problem, it's also being naive, because there are potential problems there, and it's hard to know. And therefore, to go to a full-service Starbucks restaurant where they serve all kinds of tray foods and brew the coffee and clean those kalim, those utensils, those equipment at the end of the day, is a halachic problem. There are the kiosks which don't serve hot tray food, and those are much less of a problem, and it is okay to buy coffee in these rest stop types of Starbucks like you have on the highways or in other places, in the airports maybe sometimes. But in the full-fledged ones, I'm not going to say it's forbidden. I'm going to say it's a serious halachic concern, and certainly strong room for chumrah for anybody who is a Yirei Shamayim.
So let me pass out a question that was referred to us in Eretz Yisrael, and then I'll add a question of my own. If you're in a hotel, and they offer free breakfasts, and one of the things that they offer is coffee, and they have a coffee pot there. Is it mutter to drink coffee from that coffee pot? A, and B, is there a difference between a paper cup and a cheres, a cup that they're offering for you a coffee cup? Is there a halachic difference?
Well, again, if it's a regular cup that could have been washed together with, if it's a full kitchen, a lot of these breakfast places in these hotels don't cook. They just have some food there, some breakfast food. It depends. Again, it will depend on the exact situation. It depends what other cooking is taking place and how the kalim are washed together. It's interesting. Starbucks is known to use these 3 compartments sink system, which is the crux of the problem. Other companies do not. Dunkin' Donuts does not. As a matter of fact, I once saw the Dunkin' Donuts manual. It says over there they want to protect themselves from their workers suing them. Can't use water above 120 in washing the dishes, which might be a health concern, but they don't want to use real bubbling water for their workers. So that makes life a lot easier, because then the water is hardly yatzaledisbay, and therefore the transfer of time is not a real issue. So again, do we know exactly what each worker is doing in Dunkin' Donuts? We don't have a mashgiach there. We don't have videos there. They don't let us come and check, and even if we would check, things change all the time. So it's very hard to give a clear, definitive answer, because every kitchen is different. In a lot of these places, though, I noticed, they have these coffee makers that are never washed. They just keep on adding water. They're not washed, certainly not every day. In Starbucks, though, it's different. But in these other hotels, they have these these special coffee makers. It's different, and they don't wash them necessarily, and therefore it doesn't necessarily come in contact with non-kosher. So every kitchen needs to be. You have to know. You really have to know. It's not so pashut. But Starbucks, the research has been done, and over there, it's been identified as a problem.
Can you be saimach? We'll get back to one more time to the hotels and gas stations in a second. But can you be saimach from an halachic point of view on the manuals and on the operating procedures of large companies? For instance, it's well known that McDonald's, when they produce their treif stuff, their specifications are so exact that they have down to the millimeter on how wide their burgers are, and down to the micromillimeter on their French fries, etc., etc., etc. And the Rabbi mentioned that Starbucks has a similar operating manual. Does that have a halachic takeif? Is some sort of a chazaka that they keep to that?
Their manual covers how they prepare the food and basic instructions. It doesn't cover, at least not in all cases, the cleanup process. It just tells you got to use this system. But as we know, these workers, the ones that are making $7.99 an hour, they basically do what they want. You cannot rely on them to be your mashgichim and tell us, yes, we followed exactly the way the system is. Can't. So, Lamaisa, at the end of the day, Just like you wouldn't allow in your kitchen kosher and non-kosher to be in the same area, and then, you just won't allow that because who knows how many problems can happen. Well, all these problems can happen over there. Do they? I don't know how that can be answered. I don't have a clear answer to that. But a lot of times, if you go to these gas stations, you take a look. These coffee things, they put them there and they stay there. They don't really come in contact with anything else.
Oh, they wash them in the bathroom, right?
Yeah, they wash them in the bathroom, right? I've seen that also, but they don't have this fancy protocol that they have to follow, and therefore over there it's a lot more kuldik.
So it's more kuldik. Okay, I got the Rav must live in a foreign country called New Jersey because I believe the minimum wage here in New York is now up to $15. So there's no such a thing as $7.99.
In New Jersey also they passed it to law, but
okay.
So they're not worth more than $7.99. That's what I mean.
Yeah, got it. Okay, thank you. Agudah Doniel, Neustadt. I'm always enthralled by your clarity and your grasp of complicated halachic subjects. We covered a lot of ground here, and I do wish to come back to conclude this segment by quoting a beautiful Medrash Rabbah, the Medrash in Shir Shirim, Rabbah, on the pasuk in the beginning of Shir Shirim, where the Shlomo Melech says, "L'reach shemanecha toivim," "L'reach shemanecha toivim," says the Medrash. Lama nimshal Yisrael shemen. Why is Kal Yisrael nimshal to shemen? Leimer to tell you, mas shemen einoi misarev im hamashkin. It's well known that shemen, the properties of shemen, do not allow it to be easily dissolved with other liquids. Af Yisrael eino misarev im bnei noach. Yisrael are not misarev im bnei noach, and this is the shvach of Klal Yisrael. We heard some of the approaches that one should take. The basic approach is it would be good and wise to be nizar wherever we can. Obviously, there are certain real-life things that need to have specific rabbinic supervision, but if we are able to not be Mesarev Negayim and able to think about those things that keep us separate, we will have all the Tachais at Chazal and Rabbi Seinu, Rishonim, and the Achrayim told us in the ability to remain a Am Levad Yeshkain. I want to thank Rav Doniel. I want to thank the organizers of this segment, and Emir Tashem. Soon we're going to move on to another chashuv distinguished guest. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for the opportunity, and be well. Thank you.
We are going to continue our discussion on the important concepts of Zihirus in Bishul Akum. We have as our guest in the next segment of our presentation, Rav Gerstein, who is, he'll tell you his exact title, but as far as I am concerned, he is the Baal Hilchais Gedolos of OU Kosher. Whenever there is a question as to what the current Piskei Halacha in that organization is, and of course, everybody is suffering the loss several years ago of a guy in a gadol of Yisrael Belsky, on whose very grace of places a lot of the important Piskei Halacha in this field of kashrus in general and Bishul Akum in particular was dependent. Of course, he is a Talmud of Rav Belsky for many years, and therefore it is very proper to discuss some of these issues with him today. I'm just going to begin as an Akdama because in the last segment we were very serious in quoting Rav Shlomo Zalman, Zechet Tzadik V'Kadosh L'Vracha, as to how the gzeira of his bailus and intermarriage, which has taken such a terrible toll on us, may in fact be a byproduct of our not being careful about Bishul Akum. I want to become a little bit more positive now, and I'll relate to you something that I heard from the Novominsker Rebbe, Shlita, Agudah Yarchei Kallah, just a few days ago. I went to visit him and report to him on the wonderful success of our Yarchei Kallah in Eretz Yisrael. And he mentioned to me something that he had discussed and said at a forum organized by the Rabbanim of the OU Kosher organization, which they invited many of the professionals in the field of kashrus to a halacha conference, and they asked the Rebbe to be the Magdim as a guest speaker, and he told me that Kai Haya Devarav at that forum, Bekitzer Nimritz, he said that one looks in wonder at the incredible ribui of Torah post-war in America, Shalai Kader Chateva, from basically very little in 70 years, the ribui of the growth of Torah and adherence to halacha is something which is me'al any logic and me'al any expectations. Tens of thousands of Shemer Torah mitzvahs, thousands of full-time Kol Yingalite, Sheterasum Nasam. What is this? What can this be attributed to? So he pretty much gave the flip side, the other side of the coin that Shlomo Zalman mentioned. And he says he thinks that ever since post-war, and starting with the efforts, and he mentioned he was making shame several individuals who began taking very seriously kashrus in America, and among them, of course, the OU Kosher organization. And he said it's possible that because Chazal tell us Mecholos Asuros are metamtem misalev, the incredible amount of resources and Torah efforts put in to vastly improve kashrus over what existed in pre-war America. We all know that the standards were not particularly high, and now they're very high. That has led to a reversal of the Timtum of Lev, that has led to the, whatever would be the correct phrase for the opposite, the antonym of Timtum Alev, Taharas Alev, and that has led perhaps to the incredible growth of Limud HaTorah and the growth of yeshivas and the growth of Yiddishkeit in general in America. So there's two sides of the same coin, and now we have the privilege of discussing some of the inyanim of kashrus with Rabbi Gerstein. I'm going to begin with introducing question number one, which are issues of Eila Shulchan Malachim. As many of you know, one of the major issues in Bishul Akum, in the Sugya, and in Kuf Yud Gimel, is that there is an exemption of the stricture of Bishul Akum. It only applies to those foods that are Eila and Shulchan Malachim. There's been much discussion over the centuries as exactly how to define that question. Interestingly enough, there's one set of foods that has had a lot of discussion and served Bekitzer a little bit as a battleground for these issues, and it's the good old-fashioned potato. There is a well-known discussion in the Pesachim, starting with the Chachmas Adam, and then going all the way to the Aruch HaShulchan 100 years later, whether potatoes are Eila Shulchan Malachim or not. The Aruch HaShulchan actually paskin that it's not, but as we mentioned earlier, Eila Shulchan Malachim is one of those things that is subject to hanhagais of how we eat and what we eat. And therefore, I'm going to ask Rabbi Gerstein to discuss and talk to this issue of potato chips, but I'd also would like to include French fries. Let's do the potato chips, and then we'll get to the French fries and see if that makes a difference. And there is a well-known tshuva in the Shulchan Halevi of Rav Belsky, Benegea to potato chips. I will let Rabbi Gerstein discuss the issue. Shalom Aleichem. Later on.
Yes, Aleichem Shalom, Rabbi Gottesman. Thank you for having me on the show. So you were discussing here the idea of Eila Shulchan Malachim. Before we get to potato chips, I just want to give a little bit of more of a hakdama to the concept. What exactly do we mean when we say that it's Eila Shulchan Malachim, that it's served at a king's table? Does it mean what the king eats? Does it mean if the king wants to have a snack of something? Rebelsky Zatzal has a tshuva also related to a similar idea, discussing breakfast cereals. So our breakfast cereal is considered to be Eila Shulchan Malachim. Kings also eat breakfast, and they might also like to eat Cheerios or Wheaties or cornflakes and the like. And do we say therefore that all foods that a king would eat, it's the quality that you would serve to a king, it's high quality cereals, that these are considered Eila Shulchan Malachim? And so that's really the starting point, is where how do we exactly define it? And the way I've heard it from him and from other poskim is that the term Oilo Shulchan Malachim doesn't mean what a king will eat. It means what you would serve at a king's table, and it's referring to when a king makes a party. He invites people. In fact, the lashon of the Rambam is he's discussing kloyos, which are toasted grains, which really is most of us would put that as breakfast cereal. That's basically what it is, whether it's toasted oats or toasted oats. The Rambam, his example is kloyos. He says, "Ein adam mazmin es chavero ala kloyos." A person doesn't invite his friend over to eat toasted grains. So the Rambam, instead of using the lashon Oilo Shulchan Malachim, he uses the expression Ein adam mazmin es chavero. A person doesn't invite his friend over. That doesn't mean when you have someone over, you might serve them breakfast. You might serve them Cheerios for breakfast. That there's nothing embarrassing about that. But you don't invite your friend over to eat Cheerios. When he's over, he stays over the night. You give him in the morning. You give him breakfast, of course. But when I invite him for a meal, I invite him for a Purim Suda, I invite him for a Shabbos Suda, I invite him, certainly a Chasna, something that you invite someone to, an invitational meal. Imagine inviting someone to please come, I send you an invitation, and then you finally show up and I give you a bowl of Cheerios. So that's embarrassing. That's the meaning, right? So the idea
let me ask Rabbi Gerstein a shaila that someone asked us in their Tzral last week. He's a highly placed professional, and in the professions they have breakfast meetings. And he's been at many of these meetings where, high-powered lawyers or investment bankers go out to breakfast because they chas v'shalom don't want to be mafsik in the middle of the day, and they serve breakfast. And what do they serve for breakfast? Cheerios. Does that have any indicator of making it Elon Shulchan Malachim?
Right. So again, if I'm in those type of examples, I'm not inviting the person over for a meal. I'm inviting the person over for a meeting. I'm having a business meeting. Just at the business meeting, we have to serve something to eat. They might have a bowl of pretzels on the table during a meeting. That's not. Again, it's not that there's anything wrong with eating kloyos. Nothing wrong with eating toasted grains. But that's the Rambam's example, which I would say whether it's a toasted grain or whether it's a corn flake, it's all the same. It's really they're just other forms of toasting. Whether I toast a corn or I toast an oat or I toast a wheat kernel, it really it's irrelevant. So that's the guideline. Is it has to be something that inherently it is chashuv. In fact, Rebelsky, just to go on to another related topic, took this even to a further level, and he said, not every food that is even served at a chasna is considered Oilo Shulchan Malachim. One would think that is the definition, right? If I served it at a wedding, that means it's Oilo Shulchan Malachim. He said, no, you could have things that are at a chasna that are inherently not chashuv. They're served together with other things. He gave as an example beans. Okay, beans aren't chashuv. That was something he used to say all the time. Beans aren't chashuv. You could try to make it chashuv. I can make a 3-bean salad where I put in beans and I put in whatever it is, and it has nice colors to it, and I might even serve it at a wedding. But you could serve it when I serve other things along with it that are chashuv. If I would come to a wedding and I'm just being served a 3-bean salad, so that's like being served Cheerios. I could serve the guy Cheerios, perhaps I could sneak it in at a wedding if I found a way to do so between on a skewer between pieces of meat. That doesn't mean that the Cheerios are now chashuv. I just found a way to incorporate it. I found cornflakes. I could put them onto my chicken, and I could make southern fried chicken that way. So there are many ways I could use non-chashuv foods at a chashuv meal, at an important meal. But that doesn't mean. So that was the way Rebelsky said. It has to be that the food itself inherently has a certain level of chashivas to it. Now, getting to potato chips, so he said the potato chips are, again, they're not chashuv. I wouldn't invite someone over to eat potato chips. That doesn't mean that there's no place for potato chips. You could at a kiddush or you might be able to put a bowl of potato chips and it'll get eaten up and people will enjoy it, or at a Shabbos party, or with kids like potato chips, or there's many places where you might find use for potato chips. But again, ina de mazmin es chavero means I don't invite you over to eat potato chips. Now a kugel, okay, I wouldn't only serve you a kugel, but that's something that's a potato kugel, let's say. That's a chashuv thing. I bring it out. I serve you a slice of potato kugel. I serve you chicken, right? Meat, obviously fish, even a potato. I serve you a potato. That's something that will be served as a to give chashivas to a person, which is really what the Aruch HaShulchan is at least in his day he was taking issue with, that he said that you did not have chashivas. You would not serve that to a person. Again, along the lines like Rabbi is discussing, but he held in his day the potato didn't have the chashivas. It was a poor man's food, and he says even though rich people also eat it, potatoes, he says that's because it's so plentiful, it's everywhere, everybody ends up eating it. But it doesn't give any chashivas. It doesn't show any sign of respect. It doesn't that I give somebody a potato to eat. Now, some people have an issue with the potato chip, not because they think that potato chips are olo shulchan malachim. I think almost everybody could agree that potato chip is not chashuv, it's not olo shulchan malachim. But there's another issue that people have, which is that the min, the potato, right, the species that we're dealing with over here, is something which is olo shulchan malachim. So if a potato is olo shulchan malachim, maybe we say that incorporates every food that you could make out of a potato would all automatically become olo shulchan malachim. And there seems to be, from some poskim, the way they write, there seems to be some legitimacy to this taina, that the way they write indicates that they go with the idea of the min. They say this min is chashuv, especially when it comes to meat. Some of the poskim write that meat always is bishul, it has to be bishul Yisrael, because meat is inherently chashuv, even though I could give the question that's asked is the intestines, the bnei me'ayim of an animal. The Gemara says is not chashuv. Says achleu lav barinish. People that eat intestines are not they're not respectable people. So how can you say then that that's olo shulchan malachim? There seems to be an inherent contradiction over here to say, right, that it's not chashuv, and yet we see that there's Bishul Akum by the bnei me'ayim, the intestines, the stomachs, parts of the animal that most people have never eaten and no interest in eating. So that's what this tshuva that you were talking about, the Rebelsky wrote. That's the issue that he's addressing, is how do we differentiate between different types of meat that we're saying always are chashuv, and the potato versus the potato chip, which we're saying is not chashuv. So that's what Rebelsky deals with.
Let me ask you a couple of follow-up questions if I can, and
sure.
Before we get back to the potato, let's start with the cereal. So therefore, Mike, and again, many of these questions were brought up last week in Yerushalayim, where we had the participation of many of your chashva colleagues. Does that mean when the OU gives a hechsher on cereals, and many of the cereals that we all ate when we were growing up, once they got the hechsher, does that mean that inherently it's not Bishul Yisrael in the sense that no one is turning on the machine for Rice Krispies, for Kellogg's Rice Krispies, and we are being samech that's not elo shulchan malachim? Would you therefore say it would be a nice hidur to buy the other cereals that may in fact be Bishul Yisrael, or does everybody samech on this type of psak? What's the operating issue?
Okay, well that's a good point. Yes, the correct answer to question number one is yes. The cornflakes and the Rice Krispies and the Cheerios are not made Bishul Yisrael. The OU does not require that. Therefore, though Mashgiach visits, and they visit, often, they're not coming every day to turn on the fires. So we're relying on the fact that, like the Rambam writes, the klayos are not the mazmin es chavero. It's the equivalent of today's toasted grains are our cereals. If somebody wants to be mahader to buy, a brand that is Bishul Yisrael, so kol hakavod. There's certainly nothing wrong with that. It's praiseworthy. It's definitely a nice thing. So, but
the point I guess I'm trying to make is the point I'm trying to make is that it shouldn't be viewed, and this is I guess a subtle issue. Being saimach on a psak that a cereal is not a lashon lachem is not a kula, so to speak. In other words, I think
I think it's pretty clear.
Rebelski was not a makel. Rebelski was a paisik.
No, he's right, exactly. This wasn't a b'di'evid psak that he gave. This wasn't a shas hatchak. This was the lechatchila. This was, to him, was very, very clear. It was, in fact, it was mentioned to him about another famous, I'm not going to mention the name, but a very famous Gadol, Adam Gadol, Paisik Gadol Maod, who was machmer on cornflakes, and Rebelski's response was, we have to separate the lumdis from the mitzias. And, he said in lumdis you could hear why there's a makom to be machmer on cereals, but in mitzias, in how we give a psak and how we deal with everyday living, he felt that there's no need to be machmer at all. So
Rebelski would not necessarily have agreed with a quote, and this I see this is really printed by Rav Wosner in the Sefer itself. That Bismanenu, everything is kamat, everything is el shulchan malachim. He wouldn't necessarily agree with that.
He did not agree with that.
Okay. Since you mentioned potatoes, and you mentioned potato chips, and therefore inherently potato chips, even though you can serve it to a chashuv person, since it wouldn't be part of a formal suda, is not el shulchan malachim. Let's talk about the following, and this is only semi-facetious. It's a real story. It happened a month ago. The United States government went on a shutdown. Everybody must have heard this. And there was a very chashuv sporting event, which the minig in Washington was that the winners of this sporting event, a college football team, gets invited to the White House as a reward for their victory. The problem was, and usually they give them lunch, the White House kitchen was closed. So when there's a chashuv president, and we don't have to go into whether he is a melech or he isn't, let's assume it's stipulated that the occupant of the White House is a distinguished person, ordered in, and we have visual evidence of this, ordered in 300 portions of French fries, and they were served at the White House on the very distinguished White House silver sets, which go back a couple hundred years, before Brias Medina. So, what would you talk about? What are French fries and nigdara?
Okay, so that's a very good question. How do we deal with French fries? And we used to argue with Rebelski. He's all about this many times because he held that French fries are not elo shochem malachim. And we used to argue that the fanciest restaurants in Manhattan serve French fries, and not only they serve it, but that's what steak and fries is probably the most popular dish that they sell. So how do we? Where does that fit into Oila Shulchan Malachim? And again, this has to do with the idea that I mentioned before from the Aruch HaShulchan about the potato, that just because something is eaten by everybody, even the wealthy people, the poor people, everyone eats it because of its plentitude, doesn't make it Oila Shulchan Malachim. And he used to say that this applies over here by the French fry. The French fry is inherently not chashuv. When you go to a chasana, they serve it at the kids' meal, the French fries. If an adult gets French fries, so that's they're making fun of you. They're you want. He said, so why is it that it's so popular? He said people like it. It's a good tasting food. The Gemara tells us, the Medrashim tell a story about the queen, the princess, who wanted to eat the dregs of the pot. But it was beneath her dignity, So she had them bring it to her secretly, in her bring it up to her bedroom where no one else could watch, and then she would eat from the bottom of the pot. Because it's the best tasting part. Everyone knows that, but it doesn't mean that it's Ola Shulchan Malachim. Today, what used to be had to be done secretly now is done publicly. Now it's done on the front lawn of the White House. Instead of the French fries being something that only was eaten, at a ball game, now it's something that's eaten, on the fancy dinnerware of the White House. But he'd say still, that's what Rebelski used to argue. He'd say it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if the king is eating it. It doesn't matter if it's inherently not chashuv. At what point do you make this distinction that something inherently becomes chashuv? When you start wanting to honor someone, when you give them a French fry, obviously when we get to that point, we'll have to change. But he said it's not that way. The fact that people like it, oftentimes people order the foods that are good tasting, that they like to eat. People like potato chips probably more than they like a lot of other foods that they eat at a chashuv meal. But it's it's beneath our dignity to sit there snacking on potato chips at a chasna. He felt the same thing about French fries. He felt it's beneath a person's dignity to eat French fries at a wedding or at a chashuv thing, or to serve that to somebody. And the idea of Olah Shulchan Aruch again has to do with an idea of kavod, of dignity, and perhaps that's something that we're lacking today in America. But
when the aforementioned the president was sworn into office, I remember, and I hunted down this picture, that the next day they had a feature article about the types of food that he likes to eat, and they're not necessarily the most distinguished food, and they specifically had a picture of him surrounded by a large shipment of potato chips. I won't mention the name because I'm not sure you give the hesher to it, maybe one of your competitors, but a large collection of potato chips, which was delivered into the White House, which he likes to eat up in his executive bedroom. So I guess it goes to the same time. Because the president eats it, doesn't make it Olah Shulchan Aruch, and therefore...
Right, like you said, it's the type of thing a person should eat in their bedroom. They shouldn't be eating it at a state dinner. They shouldn't be serving it at a state dinner.
Is there any other food? Yeah. Is there any other food which is lamdim know about potato chips and French fries? Is there any and cereals? Is there any other food which is a shtickle battling around in Olah Shulchan Aruch today? What else can you think of? What issues have you been needing under this definition recently? I know Rabbi talks about salami, where again, based on the previously mentioned shach that you quoted on the name Naim, he held that salami was Olah Shulchan Aruch because meat is minay nechal. Is there anything today
I don't know. I can mention some other foods in general that we just, that comes up here at the OU often. Granola bars or snack bars. So that again, we could call them cereal bars. Just give them another name, and obviously it will be clear where they belong. So there's a lot of snack type foods that are out there today. Maybe they're not made of potato, or maybe they're whether they're corn chips or whether they're
Pringles, right? Talk about Pringles.
Okay, so Pringles is a little bit more complicated. A Pringle is made from potato flour. Potato flour itself really is we would consider it to be Olah Shulchan Aruch, because what can you do with the potato flour? Well, you can mix it with a little bit of water, and you can make back into rehydrated instant potatoes. Whether you can get into the argument whether they would actually serve rehydrated potatoes at the White House, but again, that's not necessarily our definition. We don't need to be Olah Shulchan Aruch doesn't have to be necessarily what they do in the king's palace, but rather, like we said, what a person would be mazmin es chavero. And I think a person would invite his friend over to eat, mashed potatoes, of course, served together with other foods, but it is a chashuv of food. At all the weddings they serve it, whether it's sweet potatoes or regular potatoes. There's always some sort of a mashed up potato that's served together with the chicken and the rice and things like that. So the instant potatoes which make up the Pringles that itself is a question. How is the OU or any hashgacha allowed to certify those type of products? The answer is that the way you make instant potatoes is you steam the potatoes. It's not made with water. It's not made through boiling. It's made through a steaming process where they grind up the potatoes into fine little particles, and then those particles are steamed. Now, what does steaming mean? It means there's a direct steam line that cooks it, as opposed to it's not cooked in water, it's not baked in an oven, it's not, but it's subjected to direct steam. And of course, steam we know is very, very hot. It's hotter than boiling water. It cooks the potatoes very, very rapidly. All the heat from the steam goes right into it. It gets absorbed right into the potato, and it's the perfect way to cook it very quickly and without burning it and any issues. So that's the standard method for making instant potatoes today, or potato flour, is through steaming. Now, there's a discussion in the poskim whether steamed potatoes or steamed any food, they call it kitur, that's the term that they use for steaming, whether that's also included in the gzeira of Bishul Akum or not. Shulchan Aruch says that ishun means smoking, and smoking means even hot smoking. Like the discussion is by ishun, if I smoke basar v'chalav together, is that considered to be bishul basar v'chalav? Ishun on Shabbos, is that considered is that considered under the malacha of bishul on Shabbos? So there's discussions. It's going to get to many parts of halacha of ishun, but it's brought over here by Bishul Akum as well. It's brought in the Shulchan Aruch, and Shulchan Aruch passes that ishun is not considered bishul for Bishul Akum. So even though the foods get finished, they become ready to eat, but it's not considered Bishul Akum. It's done in a manner that's not considered a bishul. It's really a suffix in the Gemara how we deal with ishun, whether it's considered bishul or it's considered not bishul. So it's that for the Durabanan of Bishul Akum, the Shulchan Aruch paskins that we are mekel, that it is not considered to be Bishul Akum. The discussions in later poskim whether does this extend to kitur as well? Is it only smoke, or what about steam? Steam also has a resemblance to smoke. Do we consider that to be a form of smoking? Cooking in steam, is that considered like I'm smoking something? So because of many of poskim are mekel, the Minchas Yitzchak has a famous tshuva where he's mekel in conjunction with the fact if it's made in a factory. So he wouldn't be mekel steamed foods in a restaurant, but he says if it's made in a factory, since there are poskim who are mekel anyways for foods made in factories, even though the accepted opinion is not to be mekel. We don't say, well, something comes from a factory, there's no problem with Bishul Akum. No, whenever it does, the OU has to send mashkichim in to make sure that it's done properly, that it's Bishul Yisrael. But here, where you have this extra svara to be mekel, that it's done through kitur in a factory, so there the Minchas Yitzchak writes to be mekel, Rabbi Yosef writes to be mekel, many poskim write to be mekel. There are poskim who are machmer on this, at least on the kitur issue, and they say that one should be machmer on that. Again, when it comes to Bishul Akum, the standard rule is when you have a suffix in Bishul Akum, that's what it says in Shulchan Aruch, when there's a suffix in Bishul Akum, the seika is lakula. So that the policy here in the OU, based on the psukim of the poskim, was that they could be mekel on the steamed potatoes, and therefore that is the basis really for the Pringle, that it is it is made up of the potato, and of course there's other ingredients too, and then it's reshaped and reformed into something that looks similar to a potato chip, but really it starts out as an instant potato.
Very interesting, and a very, very brilliantly concise taksir of a highly complex issue. Let me ask you a sophisticated question that was posed to us last week. Naniach that we're not seimech, and they'll use not seimech, and Belsky wasn't seimech on the heter of factories, because let's assume that Rav Moshe's kavana was obviously it had to be limited to those type of factory machinery that were so unique, and B, from what I understand, Rav Belsky's havana of Rav Moshe was that it only could be used as a tziruf in a package of psukim, but not on its own. Is that a fair statement?
Correct. Right. So that would fit in over here with what we're saying about the.
I understand.
Yes.
So let's take it further. You mentioned that it wouldn't apply to a restaurant. So someone asked if the whole side of this is the heter. The reason for the ritza halon is that because if it's institutionally made in a factory, there's no possibility of chasnus. Why would a contemporary restaurant not have the same type of a heter? I mean, you're not going to go into the kitchen of a chashuv Manhattan restaurant and strike up a relationship with the kitchen staff. So why is that
right?
not considered?
That's a good point. Yeah, in fact, I mean, the Maritz alone himself probably would have applied what he's saying to a restaurant. He talks about a palter. I don't know how common it was for foods to be shipped around the world in his day, or
right.
what he was discussing.
Uncommon, right?
Uncommon. But this is something I've heard here, though, from Schechter and from others, that when it comes to the scenario that we are discussing, where foods are coming from around the world, and there is it's impossible to find out who actually did the cooking. Even if I were to fly out to that country, and there's no way for me to ever. So we understand that it's still forbidden. In fact, the way I've seen there's a write-up where someone wrote up Moshe's understanding of it. He says that Moshe held that too would be usher because of a loy plug. Even though really one could make an argument, and in these type of situations, it's so separated from the relationship that like you started off with the Shlomo Zalman, with the chasnos. These type of situations are so far from the chasnos that really it shouldn't be relevant. But no, it's still forbidden. Obviously, when Chazal make a gzeira, loy plug, we don't have a right to differentiate, and that's the starting point. But Ramosha says, therefore, but if there is a difference between this type of a situation and it's done in a totally different manner, it's done in a way where you wouldn't have this type of a cooking at home, then you wouldn't have the types of machines that it takes to cook it. The tshuva that he was talking about was making egg rolls, and there's a special machine that they had for creating the egg roll, where most people don't make egg rolls. You just buy it from the store, because if you were to sit down to try to make it, it would be too complicated. How are you going to make that egg roll thing and roll it up just right? The machinery that you need for these are very specific machines, right? Very sophisticated, and so in that type of situation, that's what Moshe was talking about, and that's why it doesn't really apply so much to a restaurant type setting, where I could probably repeat most of what they do in a restaurant. I could do in my home. It's nothing. It's not just bishum loy plug in those cases.
Well, but the machinery is somewhat different, right? In a big restaurant, okay. But I guess it's you could repeat the process. It's not a factory. That's the bottom line.
Yeah, exactly. It's right. So in those type of cases where it's completely done in a different manner, that's where they rely on this idea.
Understood. Okay, so let me follow up on because we don't have too much time left. So let me follow up on two issues that you raised, both in regard to fish. One is a food that very common food, and one is a food that is becoming very common. Let's start with tuna fish. Tuna fish has a unique set of characteristics, and the shaila is, what degree of Bishul Akum do we have in tuna fish? Tell us about that.
Okay, so tuna fish relates the canned tuna fish, at least. People want to know, does the OU require Bishul Yisrael for canned tuna fish? And the answer is the OU does not, provided that the tuna is steamed. And that means, how is it steamed? Before it's put in the can, they first take the loins, they take the piece of meat off of the fish, and it goes into a special machine where it gets cooked. How is it cooked? It's not cooked in water. If you cook it in water, you'll lose a lot of the taste. A lot of the everything will will leach out into the water. You'll end up with good tuna tasting water, but your fish will lose. So the way they cook it is with direct steam. When you cook with steam, the steam cooks the fish, but it doesn't lose any of its taste. Everything stays. The whole piece of fish stays right where it is. After they do the steaming, the fish is ready to eat. It is completely edible. Then they cut it up and they put it into the cans, and then they put it through a retort which cooks it again. The purpose of the recooking of it is to kill off all bacteria. Now it's shelf stable. It could last on the shelf for 20 years or whatever they tell you. And that's the canned tuna fish. So again, the main leniency by canned tuna fish is the fact that it's done through steam. It's done in in the other side of the world, in a factory with specialized equipment that nobody could repeat in their home. So that with that idea, that's where the OU allows tuna fish. But if you have a tuna at home and you give it to your help, and you tell them, go broil this for me, or go, any other way that people prepare tuna, they're going to bake their tuna or, barbecue it or whatever.
You mean a raw tuna, taking a raw tuna, you mean?
A raw tuna steak, right. That you have to turn on the fire, or if you're a Sephardi, you're the one that has to place it onto the fire because it has to be Bishul Yisrael. It's a tuna is Ola Shochem Malachim, and the assumption so far still is that tuna is not Nechel Chai. That's the assumption that the OU works with, is that tuna is not edible raw. Though I guess of late that is becoming more and more under fire.
We'll get that in a second. But so again,
okay.
Is it? So I assume then, therefore, the OU will only certify those tunas that it knows has been steamed. Is that
Correct.
a fair statement?
Yes, that is true.
So
in fact,
part of the kashrus process, it has to be steamed. So that's
yes. In fact, there are
okay.
tunas that they're not steamed first; that they're boiled in water. They have various reasons why certain companies want to boil them in water first. And in those cases, the OU has it Bishul Yisrael. They send the mashkiach there to light the boilers before every run.
Right. Okay. So again, this wouldn't be considered to be a kula. It's
now,
just that's the halacha. The halacha
is
the
halacha by steaming.
As Isham, it's a ferish Ramah, and we're saying in this Ramah, right? That's the bottom line.
Actually, I think it's mechaber even.
It's a mechaber, right? It's a mechaber,
right. But I would add though that those who do want to have Bishul Yisrael tuna fish, the OU does runs that say on them Bishul Yisrael, or they'll say BY, which stands for Bishul Yisrael. The kosher lePesach tunas are Bishul Yisrael because they have a mashkiach for those who's on site at the whole time, because for kosher lePesach they need to make sure that there's,
Well, this is very interesting. Let's talk about this for a second. Does the OU designate you have, as I understand, 1 million products. Do you designate BY Bishul Yisrael on various different types of products, or just
Is it only on the tuna? I've only seen it on tuna.
What's the policy?
I don't know what else.
What's the policy?
I mean, if someone wanted to make a Bishul Yisrael product, they could write Bishul Yisrael on other products too.
Yes, or there's something which is Bishul.
Yes, it could be written.
What's the operating issue? In other words, if you decide that something is not Ela Shochem Malachim, or it's Nechel Meshachai, or it's Me'ushin, then the nafkamina, operating nafkamina, you just don't send someone out there to have to turn on the fire every day. Is that the operating nafkamina?
Exactly.
Is that okay? Which is, I assume it's very costly, prohibitive to do these things, right?
Right. A common question people ask us that gets forwarded to me is, let's say something which does need to be Bishul Yisrael. Let's say like canned potatoes. Okay, they're cooked in water. They have to be Bishul Yisrael. The OU doesn't write on it Bishul Yisrael. The OU just writes it's OU. It's kosher. By definition, for us, that means it's Bishul Yisrael, because by the tuna, because there's tuna that the OU certifies that is not Bishul Yisrael, there we write on it specifically Bishul Yisrael in order to differentiate between the two. You don't have to look and find the words Bishul Yisrael on a product that needs to be Bishul Yisrael.
And when you said a second ago it's not Bishul Yisrael, you mean it doesn't have to be Bishul Yisrael.
It doesn't have to be Bishul Yisrael.
Right, so
exactly.
It's perfectly the same level of kashrus, but in this case, since it's Me'ushin, it doesn't have to be Bishul Yisrael. And we're not dealing with some Vitadik Kula, it's a Ferish Mechaber, as you said, so that's your...
Right, it's a...
Well, and Rabbi had no problems with this. It's not a Deah. It's not in any way.
I'd say... In this case of the steaming, it's a little bit of a kula in the sense that the mechaber only says it by Yeshurun, and later poskim are equating kitor to Yeshurun.
Right.
So it's a little bit of a chiddush. The chiddush goes back to the early poskim. The Zer Zahav is a pirish on the Yisef Heter. He already wrote that it's mutter, and the earlier poskim who wrote that it was mutter. The one who brought it to the modern era, I guess, would be the Minchas Yitzchak, who wrote that you could rely on this, and of course, Rabbbi.
Did Ramesh write directly on the issue
I have
question?
not seen it. No, I have not seen it.
Okay, so now let's conclude with Inyan sushi. So on the surface, the question would be obvious. So what's the question of sushi? Obviously, sushi is raw. So what possible Bishul Akum we have a sushi? So obviously, sushi comes the way it's served. It's generally served with rice, which we're assuming that the rice is a problem of Bishul. And second, I'm going to raise a question which you and I discussed yesterday, and it is actually in the Shevet Levi. Shevet Levi, the question was posed to him by a traveler to Japan. This is, I guess goes back 30, 40 years when it was still relatively new. And he came up with a chap. He wanted to eat cooked fish, and we'll discuss the kashrus questions separately, but he wanted to eat cooked fish on the smach he discovered in Japan, that sushi was a staple, and therefore fish is eaten chai. So perhaps the entire min of fish is eaten chai, and therefore there should be no stricture on Bishul Akum. This is the question that was posed to Rav Vosner. What would be your understanding of this, and what would be the OU's policy?
Well,
like this?
okay. It's a very, very fair question. I don't know what Rosner answered the person, but but I would think in Japan, where that's what they eat over there is the raw fish, then indeed it would not need to be Bishul Yisrael. If it's outside
Unless you
of
go
Japan,
back to Rive right? Now, interestingly enough, this is an interesting question. This has bearings on the Matthias questions that we discussed earlier. Is sushi now nechal? I don't travel around the world. I live in New York. In New York,
right.
I would say sushi is pretty much Oileh Shulchan Malachim, and
it's definitely Oileh Shulchan Malachim.
Right, and sushi is nechal. It's a very
I don't know if Rive is the
staple.
people.
I don't know. How do you measure Rive? Would they eat it? If they would eat it, or do they have to actually
I don't know if they have to actually eat it, but many people maybe don't eat rice or potatoes or whatever it is. But of those who were to, if you were to give it to someone to eat, who they could say, "Oh, this is disgusting." That's what Rabbi used to say. It's not a matter of whether I prefer it to be cooked, but it has to be that I would refuse to eat it until it is cooked. There are a lot of foods where they taste better cooked, and people cook them because of that, but they taste just as they taste fine. If you were to give a raw, let's say a zucchini, so people think of zucchinis as cooked foods because most people that I know will cook their zucchinis before they eat them. But Rabbi held that a zucchini is nechal chai because if you were to cut off a piece of zucchini and eat it raw, you'll see that it tastes fine. There's nothing wrong with it. As opposed to a potato or rice or many other sweet potatoes or squash, pumpkins. You can't eat them raw. They're just completely inedible until they're cooked. But other foods, they taste fine. Just people prefer to eat them cooked. There's actually an interesting discussion, just sort of related to this, about chestnuts. The chestnuts, the Ramah in the Torah Chatas writes, are nechal chai. Most of us wouldn't think of eating a raw chestnut because it's high in tannic acid, and if you eat too many of them, you'll get a stomachache. But the Ramah says that in his areas, people eat them raw. I don't know if that meant that they ate them raw, meaning one or two of them, or if people had better stomachs back then and people ate lots of them. I'm not sure.
Are we sure the Ramah is referring to what we call chestnuts? Is that clear?
I think so. He's talking about Armonim, and he's arguing on the Isser V'Heter. The Isser V'Heter, he quotes the Isser V'Heter, says that it has to be Bishul Yisrael because they're not edible, they're not Nechal Chai. And the Ramah says, I don't know what he's talking about. In my city, everybody eats them raw. That's what the Ramah writes. Now, the truth is,
if you're walking on the street in the winter in New York, you can many purveyors of chestnuts. Issues. Can you eat those chestnuts?
Right. So that's exactly the question. So the poskim discussing this, they bring other snifim perhaps to be makel. This is considered malafis asapas, even though usually we don't rely on that alone. But in conjunction with the fact that the Ramah says that it is nachal chai. So again, a lot of foods you could eat them raw; they taste fine. Maybe I don't know if the Ramah meant that people didn't like to eat them cooked. I doubt it. I assume that in where the Ramah, I assume roasted chestnuts taste better than raw chestnuts wherever you are. But again, that's not the kaveya. That's not what establishes. Right? The establishes is that people would eat it. They'd say, "Yeah, this is fine. This tastes good." Because again, oftentimes people don't understand this nakuda, this point, and they, a lot of products people think of as having to be cooked to be eaten, and eggs have to be cooked, right? Nobody eats raw eggs; it's disgusting. Like you'd say, raw fish, that's mias, at least to some people, and to other people, raw fish is good. That's what it is, the sushi or the sashimi or whatever it is.
It was pointed out a lot, and it came up in the question of the coffee in the Starbucks. In addition to the Bishul Akum question, you always have to worry about kashrus in general.
Exactly. Yeah.
So let me ask you a question. You're walking on Fifth Avenue, and a person is selling chestnuts, so we postulate the Ramah. It's nechal kamei shuchai, and therefore, meantime, Bishul Akum, you can buy the chestnuts. Do I have to worry? This guy's a professional chestnut seller. Do I have to worry that he's throwing a burger on the chestnut thing, and maybe the grill itself is
I don't know. I've never gone to one of these vendors. I have no idea what they're situation
is. Or be magzik that they're not going to be mar enough shayus.
There be somebody who maybe has experience with this, line of business, knows how it works. I don't know if the equipment is only dedicated for chestnuts or could be used to roast other foods, or the shovels.
I just point this out. Obviously, people should understand that you always have to be careful. I mean,
yes.
Even once you get away from Bishul Akum, you still have to worry about kashrus, right? So
sure. In fact, you probably have mentioned earlier that there's two reasons that Chazal forbade Bishul Akum. Rashi brings another reason. Everyone's familiar with the issue of chasnos, but Rashi in Avodah Zarah says that there's also another concern of
right?
Exactly. So that definitely applies to all these cases. You have to be careful that's indeed not happening.
Right. And the Ramon Kufyud Beis points out that you always have to be careful, even if there's a heter on paspalter, but you have to be worried that they shouldn't be using griddles that had shuman on them. So the Paiskim always underscored this. Okay, thank you, Gerstein. As always, Baruch Hashem, you're a incredible resource for cutting edge silas and Hilchos Kashrus, and we appreciate it. I think we're going to, based on the enthusiastic response that we've gotten, people, we may have to revisit this because there are all sorts of interesting psukim in this field. I know that before our Yarchei Kallah to Israel, I asked you to enlighten me, and you sent me about 10 or 12 very fascinating psukim of Agudah Rebelsky, which we only were able to touch upon one or two of them. Thank you very, very much for your participation, and in the schus of Zehirus in Kashrus to the extent that we can, and we're always grateful to the Kashrus organizations for helping us get there. Klal Yisrael should be zeicha to be a am levaded yishkain, and we should be zeicha to all the brachas that come to v'shachanti b'seichem. Thank you very, very much.
Yes, thank you very much for having me on the program.
Pleasure. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Okay, thank you very much, everybody. And as I said, in Mir Hashem, hopefully we'll get a chance to revisit some of the issues that time did not allow us to consider today. Thank you.